Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this superb cultural, political, literary panel where we are going to discuss 1925, the year that changed Western culture. My name is Tristram Hunt. I'm the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum and a friend of this fantastic literary festival. 1925, the year that saw the publication of The Great Gatsby, as well as the publication of Mrs. Dalloway. It saw T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, ending with a bang and a whimper, but it also saw the publication of Mein Kampf and Mussolini taking power in Italy. Here in Cliveden, Nancy Astor was a member of Parliament and beginning the kind of journey towards the Cliveden set. It was also a moment of incredible cultural energy, as we're going to come to discuss. Gabrielle Chanel was developing her Chanel suit and little black dress and transforming modern understandings of female fashion. In Paris, the Art Deco exhibition was moving on from Art Nouveau. But also in England, in London, we had the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, a huge triumphant success. And in New York, the Harlem Renaissance. So a huge amount going on at the time. There was a very good essay recently in the Los Angeles Review of Books reflecting on this centenary. And the author said, in reading the year 1925, I could see the seeds of virtually every aspect of our cultural life, from art, literature, theatre and music, to physics, philosophy, social science, and political discourse. So we're going to unpick those memories of 1925 and their impacts today. We're going to cross jazz, architecture, literature. We're going to move from London, New York, to Berlin, to the Côte d'Azur. So hold on. Right. I want to begin with Sarah Churchwell, who is a cultural historian specializing in The Great Gatsby and other texts. Professor of American Literature and Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. Sarah specializes in American literature and culture in the 20s and 30s. Sarah, why is The Great Gatsby such a significant text 100 years on, and what does it tell us about the place and significance of 1925?
Thank you, and thank you all for coming to celebrate really the great year of all time. So Gatsby was published in April 1925, and it's a book that sees into the heart of America and sees America losing its way. And he sees that very clearly and very early on. And it's a novel about whether there is possibility for hope in a modern, cynical world. It's a novel about whether there's possibility of ideals in a cynical world. It's about cruelty and power, and it's about the endurance of hope, which is fundamentally what the novel comes back to. There's a wonderful phrase in it that I love, which to me sort of sums up what the novel is doing. And I like it because when I was writing about it one time, I had an editor say that I'd quoted it wrong. And I make all kinds of mistakes, but I don't quote The Great Gatsby incorrectly. But what it is, it was an understandable misunderstanding, because he talks about, I don't want to spoil the plot for anybody, but in The Great Gatsby, Jay Gatsby is trying to get Daisy back, and he doesn't get her back. And the moment when he realizes that, Fitzgerald writes, he's starting to lose hope, and then he writes, only the dead dream fought on, unhappily, undespairingly. And the editor said to me, I think you mean despairingly. And I said, no, he said undespairingly. And that's the point, is that hope exists almost beyond our ability to hope. And that's what the novel is really doing. But all of that is because Fitzgerald could see around him all of those cultural changes that you're talking about, and the ways in which modern life was rushing into existence in the early 1920s. And it's a novel about that modern life, because the analogy, and it's so useful that it's a centenary, that the analogy I use in reminding people in a way to think about it is it's very much a modern novel of its time, in that he started thinking about it in 1922. He wrote it a little bit in 1923, but he was too busy partying. And then he really wrote it in 1924, and it was published in 1925. And it's the exact analogy of a novel that was published today and set in 2022, we would all know exactly what it was referring to, what it was about, who everybody is in it, what all of its references are. But what he saw was that that story about modern America was saying something profound about the direction of travel that American society was on. And one of the things that I've said about it is that it's a novel, of course it doesn't predict American politics today in any literal sense, but it describes a society that could have the political situation that America has today. So it's a prescient novel, but it's also a novel that sees in that moment something transformative happening in the United States, but also, therefore, kind of in human society.
And it's reflected in the writing. He writes it in how many months?
About 8 months across 1924. He was 28 when he wrote it. Which, if you're a writer, I think it makes everybody. Speaking of undespairingly, that I get despairingly about that. He settled down to hard work and wrote it across basically 8 months. And for those of you who know the novel, the great bravura ending, that fabulous elegy for America, and also then it's an elegy for America, and also about that humanity can't give up hoping, that it's baked into us, and we will keep hoping, and that wonderful ending, he actually originally wrote as the ending to chapter 1, and he wrote the novel in sequence. So he basically wrote that at the beginning. So he always knew what the novel was about, that it was going to be this elegy for America. And
he had a sense that it was great as it was in formation. This was a kind of, I've done it, I've got this one.
Yeah, he was making a choice. People often don't realize that Fitzgerald was a commercially popular writer, and he was seen as a writer of great talent, but not necessarily an artist. And he had to make a choice. He was at a crossroads in his career, and he decided consciously that he needed to choose whether he was going to be a commercial artist or try to be a writer or try to be a great artist. And with Gatsby, that was when he decided he was going to try to produce something great and to write a masterpiece. And so he wrote all of these letters as he was working on it to his friends and his editor saying, "This is really great. I've done something really great. I think this is the best American novel ever written." And he was devastated when people didn't see what he had done. And they thought it was beautifully written, but because it was about people that they saw as inherently trivial, it was about these rich people on Long Island, no offense, Merve, who grew up in Gatsby country. But they were seen as inherently trivial at the time, and so they couldn't understand why from their point of view, he had wasted all of this artistry. They recognized it was beautifully written. Of course, you can't read the novel and be a sentient person and not realize how beautifully written it is, but they couldn't understand why he would bother. And again, I use these analogies because it is a modern novel about its moment, and so I think the analogies can be helpful. And so what I say is, imagine if today somebody wrote an exquisitely beautiful novel about the Kardashians, and you would just go, but why? And yet that novel might be the great American novel about our moment because it's getting at something truthful about our society.
So thank you. Let's move wider from the literary to the cultural context. And I want to bring in Yana Peel. Yana is the President of Arts, Culture and Heritage at Chanel, leading Chanel's efforts in artistic philanthropy and obviously supporting this great literary festival as well. The 1920s, obviously an amazing decade for Gabrielle Chanel, but give us a sense of the broader cultural context in which she's working at that time. And again, why 1925 is such a signal year.
Fantastic, and thank you so much. I love following on from Sarah because it was actually Fitzgerald who said that one could get away with a lot more in the south of France and somehow everything had to do with art. And so it's a wonderful segue in terms of what the context was for Gabrielle Chanel and the centenary that we're celebrating actually now in the UK. Obviously, you mentioned the Paris Expo. 16 million visitors came to that Paris exposition of art décoratif. That's a number that would make even a museum director like Tristram Hunt weep with joy. It is more than the Louvre and the Met combined in any given year. And it's that idea of Paris, much as it does now, really driving and trying to continue to drive the conversation around fashion, around design, regardless of the political context. It was a moment where you had this flourishing of the design. Gabrielle Chanel was actually on the jury of this magnificent exposition. And you had the clash between the Art Deco, the florid, the beautiful, the lavish, the fragrant, the velvet, and then Courvoisier. And then you had the Bauhaus. And you had this clash where surrealism met modernism. And this moment where Gabrielle Chanel in 1921 designed this abstract fragrance, and by 1925 had created a dress that Ford would call the Ford. of the little black dress. So I think what was really interesting about the context is you had this world of surrealists who were very much in Gabrielle Chanel's circle. By 1929, she had built herself a Palladian villa, which was not Art Deco, it was not Jean-Michel Franck, it was not like Eileen Gray's villa down the road. And you had women making these really bold decisions in terms of their own trajectory. And women like Gabrielle Chanel, women like Peggy Guggenheim, women like Gertrude Stein, who coined the term the lost generation, were really able to navigate their way in this decade, which could be Les Années Folles, could be the Roaring Twenties, could be just this open moment, like in Woody Allen's film, you know, Midnight in Paris, you walk in and there are the Murphys. So I think for us, what's really exciting about mining this history 1 century on is thinking about Gabrielle Chanel at that time already employing hundreds of people across her ateliers and her store that she opened in Cannes in 23, having a turnover of what would now be $100 million, which is really extraordinary as a modern woman driving her career. And then this world of Dali, who would come and paint 14 pictures in the villa, of the modernists who were pushing against the door. And I think of this idea of André Breton saying that surrealism is not just a mode of painting, it's a state of mind. So I think there's something about that 20s that gives you a freedom. So it's very exciting to be here to think of that context and that freedom of creation by which our house is really defined.
And for Gabrielle Chanel, the move from, I mean, the death of her great lover in 1919, and then the kind of move from some of those, the strictures of her Catholic upbringing, the drawing upon the black and the meaning of black, and a quite sort of almost conservative ethic. Then something happens in the early and mid-1920s that just changes the dynamic from these foundations.
Absolutely, and I would argue that it is the circle. As you say, the Duke of Westminster comes into her life. There's an openness, there's the bringing together of people, Jean Cocteau, all of these artists whom she accompanied on her journeys. So the idea of cultural philanthropy for us is one that really stems from this desire, accompanying artists on their journeys, the freedom, the liberation. You talk about the blackness of the clothes, but something that comes to mind, as you mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance, is also the Jazz Age, the liberation, the poetry of Langston Hughes. We just saw last week, The Rite of Spring in Paris was at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and it was an all-African cast, and there was a tribute to Josephine Baker. And what I think is really remarkable as we think is that Josephine Baker was banned at the Stork Club, decades onwards, and yet in Paris, in this moment, you had this sense of liberation, and you had women like Gabrielle Chanel, like Peggy Guggenheim, like Gertrude Stein, really defining modernity. So I think that's something really exciting about that era.
Let's stay in France. I'm going to bring in James McAuley, historian specialising in art and culture in early 20th century France. James, take us to the south of France. Take us down from Paris. And again, what's happening in 1925, which kind of should interest us now?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to our wonderful festival organizers, Natalie, Catherine Sabag, and everybody else who puts on this wonderful show for having us. I know I speak on behalf of all of us to say what an honor it is to be here with all of you today, and to all of you for coming to listen to all of us wax poetic about this very poetic moment. So I'm going to start with something that Yana said, and I think it's a really useful bridge from this concept of the Great Gatsby, 1925, to France, and that is Tender is the Night, which, if anybody cares, happens to be my favorite Fitzgerald novel.
Show of hands?
Yeah, no, not at all. But Tender is the Night is this really spectacularly evocative tale of the characters Nicole and Dick Diver, who are basically sketches of Gerald and Sarah Murphy, the legendary socialites and American expatriates of the era, and of course with a cameo of what is called in the novel the Villa Soleil, which is the Hotel du Cap. So not too shabby, or not too chablis, as they say in France. But anyway, we are on the French Riviera, which by 1925 has become this this amazing sort of tableau of cultural transformation and ideas and real intellectual exchange. And I think it's really important that we talk just a minute about how we got there. So historically, the south of France, particularly the Côte d'Azur, was a very poor region, sort of oft forgotten. And then it is it's a place for olive farming. There's the perfume manufacturer at Grasse, which had a small but historic following. And then by the time we get to the late 18th century and early 19th century, it is really British elites and travelers who sort of put it on the map and popularize it as a destination for winter holidays, broadly conceived. And eventually, this continues, culminating with the visit of Queen Victoria to Menton in the late 19th century. And all of a sudden, you have a scene. And I'm kind of rapidly transversing history here. But eventually, there's World War I, the catastrophe that shatters the kind of European society as it had been for centuries on end. And in that moment of transformation, France becomes a refuge for so many. I mean, it receives millions and millions of foreigners from Eastern Europe. And in that time, the south of France becomes a particularly hospitable place for foreigners to come and find home and to seek refuge and also to sort of build new lives. And it's in that particular context that so much of this kind of cultural majesty that we're here to celebrate emerges. And the art historian Kenneth Silver at NYU calls the Côte d'Azur a dream space, and it really was. It was a place to dream a new life. And it was unlike many other resorts and enclaves in Western Europe at the time, it truly was hospitable to foreigners. And in my work, which is focused mostly on Jewish history, you will note that in the Côte d'Azur, you have these villas, these kind of fantastic spaces designed by Jewish families welcome nowhere else in any number of styles, like the Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild in Cap Ferrat, the Villa Carrillos in Beaulieu-sur-Mer. I mean, the list goes on. And this was truly a place of departure. And I think that it's just really important that the specialness and the uniqueness of the region be given center stage, because the transformations that we're talking about in 1925 could truly have happened nowhere else. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of architecture, we've mentioned Corbusier. Obviously, he is. I mean, he dies there. There's a big role for Eileen Gray, later Corbusier. Give us again a sense, 1925, and the importance of 20th century functional modular architecture.
Right. So, as Yana mentioned as well, this is also a big moment for Art Deco. There's the huge exposition in Paris that year as well. And what's amazing about the moment is that so many styles are advanced sort of concurrently. And in the region, you can see so many of them existing side by side. And it's truly spectacular. I mean, you mentioned the Eileen Gray Villa. A 5-minute drive down the road, you have this sort of neoclassical Greek reconstruction of Carrillos and the kind of Italianate palazzo at Cap Ferrat. I mean, it really is a fount of creativity all at the same time, which is rather unique.
Okay, enough of the clear skies. We're going to head now to pea-souped London with Merve. Merve Emre is a literary critic. She's the Shapiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan University, formerly Professor at Oxford and McGill, and also a contributing writer at The New Yorker, which is also celebrating its centenary today. Merve, it would be great if you spoke to Mrs. Dalloway, the great publication of 1925, and the traditions Virginia Woolf is drawing upon, the kind of modernist moment then, but also still, which we haven't mentioned yet, the trauma of World War I. We're still, we're 7 years out from what happened.
Yes, and we're still facing the spectacle of mass death, not only in the trenches, but due to the Spanish influenza, which killed more people than the war itself actually did. And the novel, at least as an art form, is really grappling with how to represent this moment of historical trauma, this moment of historical rupture. Now, one answer to that question comes a little bit earlier in 1922. And it's hard to think about 1925 in the literary arts without thinking of the kind of long shadow cast by 1922 when we see the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, one a work of prose fiction, the other a poem, trying to reckon with history in a more or less epic fashion. Both of these authors, Joyce and Eliot, are trying to think about how to absorb the entirety of the Western tradition into either an epic novel or an epic poem in order to shore up the fragments of that tradition against our ruin, the ruin of the war. And many people believe that the novel as an art form actually ends with Joyce, that Joyce pushes the novel to the absolute extreme that it can go to. He completely destroys the novel as a form, and the question is, well, what can come after that? What comes after 1922? And for me, 1925 offers a couple of different answers in the form of what I might call minor modernisms. Not minor because the novels coming out are any less extraordinary than Ulysses, but minor because they insist on looking at the ordinary, the domestic, the quotidian as a source of some kind of universal humanity. Mrs. Dalloway, to me, is one of the prime examples of that. Virginia Woolf gives us a character, sort of posh woman throwing a party one evening in London, who does very little other than walk around the city. And she insists that plumbing that woman's consciousness, even though that woman is not in any way extraordinary, is as valuable an artistic act, as valuable an act of artistic representation as Joyce trying to incorporate all the major texts of the Western canon into the frame of his novel. Other examples of the quotidian or the ordinary in these minor modernisms might include Willa Cather's wonderful novel, The Professor's House. I don't know how many people have read it, but it's one of the most beautiful American novels written in the 20s. Gets a little bit drowned out by Gatsby, which appears sorry about that year. Yes, well, it is. On behalf of all trivial Long Islanders, I'm not. But Willa Cather's The Professor's House, Franz Kafka's The Trial comes out in that year and is interested in the kind of persecution of ordinary bureaucratic systems under modernity. So there are all of these novels that want to see how it is that the dailiness or the ordinariness of life might actually give us a window into something that feels universally human at a time when human bodies and human minds have been so thoroughly and extraordinarily shattered by the aftermath of the war. At the same time, actually the other one I should mention is Ernest Hemingway's wonderful short story collection, In Our Time, which is toggling between the intense localism of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Smyrna, what is now Izmir, where I'm originally from, not trivial Long Island.
You're never going to live it down.
Sorry. Now you really got under my skin.
You've triggered us all.
My opinion.
You really got under my skin. Toggling between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Izmir, Sevilla, the bullfights there. So all of these novels that really want to look at the ordinary, the everyday, the local. At the same time, these novels insist that the ordinary, the everyday, and the local contains all the traces of the international in them. So when Mrs. Dalloway is walking around London, she hears about the news from India. She hears about the news from Ireland. When the professor in Willa Cather's The Professor's House is reminiscing on his time as a youth, he's thinking about being in Paris, he's thinking about being in the American Southwest and excavating all of these layers of history, of indigenous history. And In Our Time, of course, is both highly centered in the American north center of America. Sorry, as an East Coaster, I'm struggling for what part of what we call that, and also kind of zipping around the globe at the same time. So I think for me, 1925 is a year of these new, local, ordinary, daily modernisms that still want to make a claim to the universality of human experience in a powerful way.
Is there also something particular to London and the enormity of London? I mean, London is going to achieve its kind of full kind of population height in the 20th century about a decade and a bit later. What's there germane to London which isn't there in Paris or New York, or could it be any of those huge interwar metropolitan areas?
Well, I do think 25 is the year New York's population eclipses London's population, right, as the most populous city in the world. So I don't think it's a population thing. I mean, one thing to consider about Dalloway in particular is that, it comes out in 25, but it's set in 23. And it's set in 23 at this moment where the alliance between the liberals and the conservatives in this country is about to fall apart. And so it's a novel that comes out in 25, but is looking back at 23 as the last moment of a particular political configuration. And those of you who've read it know that she throws a party at the end, that the prime minister, who has only a few months left in office, I believe, shows up to that party, that there are a bunch of people who show up to that party that other guests think have already died, and that the death of Septimus Smith is announced at that party. So it's less a party and more an elegy, a wake even, for a particular political configuration of empire that is coming to an end. And I think she's keenly aware of that. Those are the politics, the forward-looking politics of that novel, as much as its backward-looking politics are about the First World War and the Spanish influenza.
I would be remiss if we didn't pick up from London and Paris with what connected the two of them, which was Le Train Bleu. So when we think of the technology and the possibility then of traveling from London to Paris, from America to Paris, the rise of the BBC, I believe, just the year prior.
Right.
So I think there's also something magnificent about the evolution of technology and the possibility of bringing the world to London, bringing London to Paris, and that mobility, which is so commonplace for us today. This morning, Tristram's article in the FT suggested Londoners should not move to Dubai, they should stay in London. But I do think there's something about that rise of technology and mobility that also defines the era.
I mean, the rise to, may I jump in? You pointed out when you introduced me that this is the centenary of the New Yorker, and mass culture is itself a kind of technology. That circulates in a different way than the kinds of novels we are talking about circulate. And so there is also this sense that, okay, we have the BBC, we have the New Yorker, there are now these new organs of news, these new organs of culture that are creating new publics for the kinds of books that we're talking about.
Does anyone want to speak to Berlin? Because, I mean, James, maybe, I mean, there's,
Sure.
there's the political context.
I was going to say, I thought, Merve did an excellent job summarizing the moment of World War I, but there's also the aftermath of World War I that's very, very important to consider. And, Tristan, as you began the panel, you mentioned that Mussolini came to power in this pivotal year we're discussing, but it is also very important to note that in 1925, a man who had led a failed coup against the German government began writing a book in a jail cell, and that man was Adolf Hitler, and the book was Mein Kampf. And so 1925 is this year of glorious cultural transformation that we have been talking about, but it is also very much a year when the clouds began to gather over Europe yet again. And it would take some time for those clouds to metastasize into the catastrophe of National Socialism and the fascism that ripped the continent apart a generation later. But it's very important to note that in this moment, part of the cultural transformation that we are discussing included all of that darkness. And it's an inherent part of the story that can't be ignored either. And so it is one thing to romanticize the sort of halcyon days of Nicole and Dick Diver on the French Riviera, but it is crucial to realize that, the great line in Gatsby reminds us, the party was over. And in some ways, in 1925, it already was. It's just that so many of the participants didn't quite realize that.
Yeah, that's the thing about history. Sarah, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say a couple of things to that, which is that, I'm not going to bring everything back to Fitzgerald, but it is fascinating how he links so much of this because, and it is him kind of having his finger on the pulse in a way that he really did. But he of course, he wrote Gatsby in the south of France, in Saint Raphael, but he finished it in Rome, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. And he was in Rome as Mussolini was taking power, and he was watching fascism as he was writing Gatsby, which I actually think is a really, really important filter for us to think about the novel through. And we've been talking about some of the trends in America, and yet not. And you mentioned the Harlem Renaissance, but not yet bringing the Harlem Renaissance into the story that we're telling, which of course is incredibly important for what it brings to the U.S. and then to the world. And the Jazz Age, which of course again is Fitzgerald's phrase for the era, but he's obviously what's happening here is
just remind the room briefly.
Sorry.
The Harlem Renaissance. Sure.
So so basically what happens in the 1920s, which is so important, is that African American culture starts to see itself as having something valuable and authentic and integral that has its own identity, and that its art, because it's been treated as an inferior culture, as obviously an inferior race, but therefore that its art and its culture is also, was seen by white mainstream culture as being inferior. And what happens in the 1920s is this great generation of black artists stand up and they say, no, our culture is also great. And Langston Hughes, the great poet Langston Hughes stands up and says, I too sing America, right? And which of course is answering Walt Whitman. And so saying, in Leaves of Grass, right? So saying that we are also part of American culture and writing amazingly wonderful poems, experimental work. Jean Toomer's Cane, which is an amazing book, is also 1925 and really far ahead of its time. And so all of these great poets and writers are, and musicians most familiarly, are flowering and asserting the brilliance and the beauty of black culture and this kind of racial positivity that they're articulating for the first time. And of course, a lot of that is embodied in jazz. And so jazz being the popular art form that had been seen as a degraded form because it was racialized and it was therefore viewed with suspicion by white cultural gatekeepers, and yet then the younger generation picks it up and they make it their own. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with that transformation of jazz from a very unrespectable form, and they certainly didn't see it as an art form. And it's only, in the 50s really, that it starts to be seen as art rather than just as. They would use the word jazz in the 20s. Critics would use the word jazz in the 20s as a pejorative. They would say it like we would say pop. Oh, it's just jazz. It's just pop. It's just trashy. And they didn't see it as a serious art form, partly again because of its origins in African American culture. And so the idea that you could write poetry out of jazz, that jazz could infuse the writing that you're doing, that you could use the blues as well, which of course Langston Hughes and others are doing at the same time. So this sense that finally, at least in the cultural and artistic space, white and black are starting to come together. And then, of course, what you see then is a massive, massive backlash against that. And it's very important, for example, again, just to use because these are kind of massive generalizations, but to bring it back to something specific, people are often baffled, in my experience, by Fitzgerald depicting Tom Buchanan as a white supremacist, and that he's a very virulent white supremacist in the beginning of the novel. And people are sort of confused by it because they don't see that as being one of the themes of the novel. But it's a novel about power, and power in America in the 1920s was white supremacist. Just was. So that's just realism, is what he's doing there. And that's part of those dark, of those dark shadows that you're talking about, is understanding the ways in which what we're talking about is all of this glamour and all of this sense of possibility, and yet the ways that power is going to react to that.
I'm going to lift it to a positive note, if I may. Just thinking about Gerhard Richter.
Well, and the Harlem Renaissance is completely positive.
No, but also Gerhard Richter, going back to Germany, the idea that art is the greatest form of hope. So building on from that, the merging watching the fusion by Picasso, Demoiselle d'Avignon, having seen the African influences in the Paris Expo, suddenly there was a colonial reach that brought these great influences into the art. So of course there was so much darkness, but also you saw in exile the emergence of the Bauhaus. We've all seen the Brutalist, and this idea that out of that darkness there's also these great artistic expressions that emerge.
Right, and
hold on, just hold that, because Merve, I want to come to you on this kind of global cultural and colonial context, because as I said in the beginning, we had the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. We've got the learnings in Europe from non-European art forms in a really new and exciting way. But we've also got at that moment the beginning of really significant anti-colonial forces emerging, which are then kind of impacting discourse within Europe.
Well, it's beginning earlier. I was just thinking about something you said. You said it sort of off the cuff to Jake about how you always just see history a little bit too late, right? And
I do.
Well, no, but I think in general, that's how history is made, isn't it? Retrospectively. And one of the interesting things about all of the novels that we're discussing, at least, is that they are looking back at earlier moments to try to reclaim the origins of historical movements or forces that are only being felt or are being felt at their fullest in 25. So what you said, Sarah, just made me think about that extraordinary moment in Gatsby when Nick and Tom are in the car, and it pulls up alongside the car with the black jazz singers in it, right? And
we don't know that they're just black passengers.
They're black passengers,
but they're being driven by a white chauffeur.
Yes, and there's this kind of look that
haughty.
Yes, this look that Tom Buchanan gives them, and you sort of think, what if we followed that car as opposed to this one? What alternate history might we end up in? In Hemingway's In Our Time, you're looking back at what was politely called the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, or what was not yet then Turkey, but you're looking at that moment of population exchange and the death of thousands of people in this act of forcible relocation, of ethnic cleansing that's happening on the Western Turkish, not yet Turkey, Ottoman, whatever coast. So there are these ways that these minor modernisms always want to figure out how to cast a kind of backward or too late eye onto those gathering clouds. And I think, as you said, Yana, to try to make art out of them, which isn't necessarily to redeem those terrible political currents, but to say they have to be part of our collective cultural representation. This has to be part of the project of art. In Dalloway, at least, when she talks about the news from Ireland or the news from India in 1923, the news from India and Ireland there are about riots against the empire. And by 1925, you have in India the formation of the Indian Communist Party and the formation of the RSS, the paramilitary organization that is absolutely behind the BJP today and behind Modi's stronghold on power. So there's this interesting way in which everything we're talking about is like looking back, but it's also looking forward to where we find ourselves now, which is what makes it a kind of pivotal year in this way.
And it was that moment. I mean, we sometimes think of the British Empire sort of culminating in the early 1900s. Actually, it's the interwar period when the British Empire is at its greatest extent, and a sense of itself is so kind of prevalent within civil society within Britain. James, let me just loop back to you on particularly, because, I mean, Britain in the 20 years following 1925 is going to see this incredible influx of brilliant Jewish modernist thinkers. Is there something about 1925 you want to explore about Jewish culture and the Jewish contribution, particularly to the modernist moment?
Sure. I mean, I think another very important event to keep in mind in thinking about this moment holistically are the brutal pogroms in the Pale of Settlement and then the Russian Empire beginning in the 1880s, but continuing with a vehemence all the way after the revolution, the Russian Revolution in the 1920s. And this triggers a massive immigration wave of Jewish emigres to the West. And France, I mean, Britain to some extent, but France receives more of them than anywhere else. Even in the United States in the initial years. And so you have this real intellectual ferment of displaced intellectuals who settle in the great capitals of the West, in London, in Paris, in New York, and who really change the fabric of culture in their own respective ways. And there's a lot to be said about that in specific examples, but just sort of on a very macro level, that's another important theme, I think, in this pre-war moment, or interwar moment, I should say.
And in terms of fine art and decorative art, do we want to, I mean, in the UK context, bring out the work of Paul Nash or Henry Moore, or what's 1925 kind of giving us for this moment? Anyone?
Isn't, I mean, it's way beyond my expertise, but isn't Chagall has started painting by this point?
Kandinsky, Chagall, McAuley, Nagy. So in terms of that generation also.
Yana, give.
And Stein. I mean, we can talk about Stein and modern art till the cows come home, right?
Yeah, so the lost generation, I think, is also this interesting concept. And so you don't have one form dominating. As you say, you have this confluence. And I think that's the hybridity that makes it so exciting.
Well, and this interest in how art is made, right? Which are, of course, also feeding into architecture at the time. But so, you get, Stein, is writing this very modernist work at the time, which is inspired by the modern painters that she's seeing. And she's trying to render what Cézanne does in paint in the sentence. And what she's trying to do is the way that Cézanne makes you see the brushwork, that he makes you see the paint, and that you look at the paint. And she was very, very interested in that and wanted to know if you could do that on the level of the sentence. You can, it turns out, but a lot of people find it unreadable. But you can do it, and that's what she does, right? And so you also have this wonderful sort of dialogic sense that comes into the arts in the 20s of the ways, and we already mentioned the importance of jazz here, of trying to write blues into poetry or into novels, rather, or the way that they're borrowing from cinema, and the way that all of the new art forms are feeding each other, and they're learning from each other and experimenting. And
I think the collectors are also very important.
Yeah.
So when James talks about these great villas, Villa Frusi, Villa Kerylos, the villas that were then left to the French state. What we're seeing is collectors and dealers like Peggy Guggenheim actually buying one painting a day.
Yeah.
So there is this idea that you have the rise of these great collectors that are defining taste, that are defining style.
And of course, Gerald Murphy,
sure,
right? Painting and collecting. Right.
But you go now to the Guggenheim, as we were last week, with Julie Moretu, a MacArthur genius, who takes everything from Kandinsky, and you realize that in that moment, some of that questioning is what actually drives the answers that we are finding across the world in the arts today.
I'm going to come out to the audience in a moment, so have your questions or thoughts ready. The flip side of this is what, in a sense, is behind us, which is the pastoral, because in contrast to this celebration of modernism and urbanism, England in the interwar years rediscovers the folk, the craft, develops a notion of England. So where are we seeing this contrast between the kind of the ultra-modernity and then the pastoral? Why is this happening?
I'll just make a plug for one of my favorite books by the great literary critic Frank Kermode called History and Value, and his argument about the pastoral, particularly in the interwar period, not 25, a little bit later. His argument about the pastoral is that it becomes a way for bourgeois writers to imagine the lives of working class people. And that it comes back at a time when the possibility of a true communist revolution, both politically and in the arts, is exhausted. And so it's left to these well-intentioned bourgeois writers of Oxbridge to try to reclaim the pastoral in order to get to some kind of working class aesthetics.
But
we can argue about that.
That doesn't explain like the cycling groups, the shell guides.
I don't think he was interested in cycling groups. You're right. But yeah, I'm happy to hear another explanation.
If you're making a plug for books, I will make a plug for Tweed. So there's something about the pastoral that is also an extraordinary inspiration for Gabrielle Chanel in her life with the Duke of Westminster. The yachting, the shooting, the fishing, the hunting. There is something that finds its way to that 1923 boutique in Cannes that finds itself into the 1927 store in London. And so there's something about this idyllic, bucolic countryside as embodied by the Duke of Westminster that finds her building this La Pausa retreat in the south of France, which later, scene spoiler, Winston Churchill ends up writing the history of the English-speaking peoples in over 600 days as a guest. So there is definitely no nurture without nature.
I mean, the other thing, oh, sorry, can I say something very quickly, Sarah? The other thing I'll say, just to take it back to Dalloway, is that I imagine many people in this room have read it, and there's that wonderful moment outside of the Regent's Park tube station where there's an old woman who's just singing, right? She's singing, nobody understands what she's singing. Septimus Smith and his wife Rezia hear her, and what they imagine that she's singing is a tale of the land before the city, of what London was like prior to urbanization, what it was like prior to even the presence of human beings. And actually the other novel that comes out in 25, totally minor modernism, is by a woman named Mary Butts, who is from Dorset. It's called Ash of Rings. And it imagines a kind of Neolithic history for the south of this country, completely invested in the pastoral. Virginia Woolf wouldn't publish it because she called it a nasty little book about the Greeks on the Downs. But there is something about, like you said, you know, this is when London is happening. And so the flip side to that, or the countervailing force to that, is to imagine, what if it hadn't happened? What would all this land look like without it?
Which they then do in Charleston as a kind of...
Well, and it's also, that's of course, again, that's what the end of Gatsby is about too, right? Which is imagining seeing the American continent for the first time, and the way in which it symbolizes possibility, which is, you know, the pastoral is a symbol, right? So what's it symbol? Well, it's symbolizing, you know, lost paradise. It's symbolizing lost hopes as well, and lost ideals. And so all of that stuff, I think, circles back to this idea that, you know, that you were talking about as well, Merve, about, you know, the question of how can we rebuild after the war, after that devastation? Can we reclaim our hope? Can we reclaim our humanity? And what, you know, what Fitzgerald is saying at the end of Gatsby is, you know, you're confronted with all of the possibility, literally, of the world in front of you, and you build Las Vegas. Like that's what, you know, that's what really, you know, fundamentally.
Okay.
Right. Or to die.
He's saying.
Emma, Las Vegas. Right. Questions, comments, thoughts. We've got roving microphones. You've just like absolutely bulldozed them into silence. There's a gentleman right at the back over there. Is there another?
Hi. One of the things in Gatsby is this idea of sort of careless people, and what kind of that economic cultural moment, can you see parallels today and the emergence of careless people today?
Yeah.
Hold that thought. We're going to have the lady here.
Let's fast forward 100 years. How do you think your successors will be discussing 2025?
Okay. Is there a third? No. Okay. So let's begin with careless people.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's literally the title of my book about the Great Gatsby and Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. And that's very much at the heart of what the book is about. So yes, I think when I said at the beginning that I think it's a fundamentally prescient novel about where American society was heading. That's what it's talking about. It's a novel that sees carelessness not just as negligence, but as a way of wielding power. That carelessness is the certainty that everybody else around you is there to clean up the messes that you make, and that you can just bulldoze your way through the world and you don't have to think about it. So it goes something beyond just, it's not indifference, it's something more destructive than that. And so when we live in a world now where people are talking about accelerationism as a, you know, let's you know, or Silicon Valley, you know, move fast and break things, that's careless people. You know? So it's a world of oligarchs, of careless oligarchs, and that's what the novel is about. He says, you know, that Tom and Daisy were careless people. They smashed things and then they withdrew back into their vast wealth or their carelessness or whatever it was that held them together, right? And that, to me, is a description of the powerful today, unquestionably.
And what do we think the distinction is then between a kind of Gilded Age carelessness and a Roaring Twenties carelessness?
Well, the Gilded Age, so one of the big differences, of course, at least in the US context, is that the Gilded Age, they were, we mustn't romanticize the robber barons of the Gilded Age. They were often murderous. They were unbelievably careless with human life.
Apart from Waldorf Astor, he was...
So not all of them, but many, many of them were. And of course, this is an important point too. You know, in Gatsby, that when Gatsby, again, plot spoiler, Gatsby dies. When his father comes for the funeral at the end, he says, if he'd have lived, he would have been a great man. He would have been like James J. Hill. And people don't get that reference anymore, and they don't really know what that means. But James J. Hill was one of the robber barons. He was a railroad magnate from St. Paul, and he was a very bad man. And so this is like saying, if my son had lived, he would have been a great man. He would have been like Elon Musk. And then you'd be, oh, well, but is that a good thing? I'm not sure that's a good thing. You know, and he goes, yeah, I think that's true. So, but what the Gilded Age did do, most of them anyway, these are vast generalizations, of course, but having created all of those fortunes, because some of them cared about the afterlife or they cared about their legacy in some sense, there was a philanthropic turn. So they built things. So they built universities, they built libraries, they built museums, they donated things. So at least they gave something back to public life, which you start to lose in the 20s and going forward to today.
James, 2025, what will they look? What will our forefathers?
A good question. I mean, for one, I think the baby boomers will still be alive. So, we'll
and in power, and they'll still be in the Congress.
Still in power, right? The Congress in the U.S.
coming
will
to
be
the Clinton Literary
exactly
Festival.
the same. No, I mean, you know, to the point that we made earlier about, you know, kind of not understanding history in the moment, I mean, that's very true. And I think, you know, when you write history, you become more humble about judging your subjects because you realize you cannot evaluate your own moment at all. And I think so many of us in this room probably have had the experience of having been confounded by events in some way or other in recent years. And I am fascinated by the proliferation of comparisons invoked by our commentators and historians. And, you know, for a while, you know, we had, in the American press, we had tons of comparisons to Weimar Germany. We had another sort of school of commentators that compared our moment to France fin de siècle and the Dreyfus Affair and the sort of hyperpolarization of that. And what you realize is that we are all always constantly struggling for something to make legible the fundamentally illegible nature of contemporary life. And so the answer is I have no idea.
No,
and I don't think any of us can.
That is, by the way, the right answer. I mean, and you showed your working. That was good. Right, more questions, thoughts, comments? Yep, we've got us in the middle here.
Hi. I preface this by saying The Hours is one of my favourite novels of all time. But there has been such a load of awful Gatsby retellings or spin-offs since it came out of copyright. Do you think there are any novels that we should just say collectively, no, you're not allowed to come out of copyright?
Merve, what?
Sorry, is the question, no, we will not make movies out of these novels, or is the question...
Movies, fine.
Movies
I think
are fine.
like really schlocky, like Gatsby, but crime.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah.
The Great Gatsby.
You may not have come across
the Great Gatsby, but with vampires or
exactly.
zombies.
I mean,
Redford and DiCaprio are okay.
Yeah. That's fine. Right. Okay. Are there novels that we should keep in copyright indefinitely so that they don't become bastardized by the currents of the present? No, because I actually think what Sarah said about the great American novel of today being a romantic realist treatment of the Kardashians is absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. Like I actually think that is right.
I'm not being facetious.
Yeah, I don't think you are. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's fine to preserve a literary tradition. I believe in that through and through. I also think that the challenge of writing a novel or doing any kind of artistic representational work today is learning how to find the right form of expression for the currents of the time, for history as it is being made, as Jake said. And it's so tempting, right, to reach for, I mean, in some way, what you're saying is actually not too dissimilar from what you're saying about being like, isn't Trump another fascist regime, just like, the rise of Hitler? That kind of analogy is as inappropriate as The Great Gatsby, but make it zombies of contemporary late capitalism or whatever, right? They're both trying to find an old model to fit a new set of problems. And I think the trick is to articulate a new form, a new style, to keep making it new, even after modernism.
If I can jump in, I think to invoke techno-optimism as well and what that will mean in the hands of artists. I think there's also something fantastically exciting. We're working in building a school for artists and technology in California where we're seeing just the kind of innovation that artists are having with the tools of tomorrow like they had with the paint tubes that led to Impressionism. So I do think in terms of 100 years on, let's hope that we are still here at the Clifton Literary Festival, that there's a supremacy of human imagination and creation, and that we are empowering artists with the technologies of the day to go further than we could ever possibly imagine.
How great to get a 100-year sponsorship agreement.
The Ton Chanel is long.
Any more questions, comments, thoughts? Sarah, you come in.
Okay, so just very quickly, just on that same point as well, it's just that because we can't also control for inspiration, and the number of great works of art that are inspired by other novels, right? I mean, Fitzgerald is using Keats all the way through Gatsby, and if we were trying to control who gets to use, because many people would have thought when Gatsby was written that it was an inferior version of Keats, right? And to say, why have you written this trashy modern novel about, that's using Keats? Or, Jane Austen using the Gothic, right? So we can't control for the ways that great art might be produced out of those kinds of inspirations as well. So I think we have to take the zombies along with it so that we can get Keats and Gatsby.
I'm very much in favour of the zombies. Yes? No. I think the microphone's just coming. Actually, we've got two, so one at the back and then the lady there. Yep. Down the row in the jumper here. Great.
Yep. Tristan, apologies if you've actually done this, but a question for you. Would you curate 1925 at the V&A, and what would it look like?
So the microphone cut out of it. Would we have a 1925 exhibition at the V&A? It's always so annoying when you get to the year in which there's a sort of anniversary and you haven't planned 3 years before to have the exhibition. I think there probably would have been a good kind of Art Deco exhibition and a 1925 exhibition, but I missed the 300th anniversary of Chippendale, so I'm already in difficulties. But I think what we've shown today is just how it's a sort of rich, exciting period it is. I think the sort of the darkness of 1925 and knowing what comes after will also would be part of that.
Is there an object in the V&A storehouse in the East from 1925 or thereabouts that particularly excites you?
There is, Yana.
Oh!
At V&A Storehouse, open 7 days a week in London's Hackney Wick, we have this incredible backdrop from 1924 into 25, which was the theatrical backdrop for the Trembler, for the Great Ballet Russe production. And it was from a tiny Picasso work, then expanded into this remarkable backdrop, which you can now see for yourselves. And Yana, just tell us a little bit about how significant this work is.
I think it's the largest Picasso in the world. I think it might have been kindly brought into the world with the support of Gabrielle Chanel and her participation in accompanying artists like Picasso to make great ballets, which we still continue to enjoy today.
But again, also what's so interesting is that it's that modernism, but also her drawing upon those kind of Slavic traditional inheritances and the kind of the tension she was drawing out between those of that kind of pivot year. Anyway, come and see it. Right, final question or thought? No, okay. So we haven't asked two of you about 2025. Merve, what are the historians of the future going to draw out about 2025?
God, what a mess this year has been. I can't believe Donald Trump has only been in office for 9 months.
It's exhausting.
I mean, truly, like, you want to see careless people, look at the current American administration. It is despicable what is happening in America, and I hope everybody looks back upon this year, not in 100 years, but next week, next month, a year from now, and thinks about the recklessness, the cruelty, the incompetence, the sheer madness of the current political administration.
But in terms of culture,
sorry. But what culture, right? He's defunded the National Endowment for the Arts.
Okay. Bank that.
Shall I lead on a positive note? A great American philanthropy coming into the UK.
Could someone set me up with a Picasso that you happen to have?
Yeah, exactly. Is there anything that has sparked, from your pew at the New York, is there anything in literature, film, streaming, art that this year you think, this captures this moment?
I am thrilled that the Hungarian novelist Laszlo Krasznahorkai won the Nobel Prize in Literature a few days ago. A kind of brilliant writer of the atrocities of Eastern Europe. Sorry. I'm going to try to keep it positive. But I do have faith in a certain kind of global, international literature that keeps us invested in these questions of style and form and basic humanity against our tech overlords and our aspiring dictators.
Thank you. Yana, 2025, what are we going to take?
We are so grateful in this country for great American philanthropy. Okay. So I think as we look at the great institutions at the V&A, at the National Gallery, at the National Portrait Gallery, I think we're so excited to be open for great friends coming from around the world. And so, as you suggest this morning, while others are suggesting that there's mobility out of the UK, I think this incredible festival is a testament to what makes Britain so great. I know I sound very foreign, but I've actually been here for 30 years. And I just want to champion the fact that it's very exciting that great institutions, cultural centers, and festivals like this one really ensure that our great traditions continue to be celebrated across the world and not just any weak economic growth or any deregulation, because I think there's just so much to champion in the UK today, and it's really wonderful to be able to thank Natalie and Catherine and Sebag and Andrew for enabling us to live this primal experience of coming together around great ideas and words and writers.
Sarah, 2025?
I can't really follow that. No, I'm just going to say that it's. I'm going to come back to where I started, which is that what I take from that great novel is the endurance of hope, and that hope is the thing that, and it's not a banal hope. It's the hope that survives even when you've stopped hoping. It's the paradox that he builds into the end there, that we cannot exist without hope, and we will keep finding hope, and we will keep rebuilding our ideals, and we will keep chasing our dreams. That's what the novel's about fundamentally. So you have to confront the darkness for the hope to actually matter and to lift you. If you haven't actually seen what the threat is, it doesn't matter. And then the fact that we still have hope and we still build and we still try to do better is the whole point.
Ladies and gentlemen, 2025, 1925, darkness and hope. Thank you.